Hello, welcome to Lily's Stories, where I share my passion for storytelling. Hope you enjoy the journey. The grand ballroom of the Scott Hotel glittered with the expectation of success. Erin Scott, a formidable figure at 62, stood at the podium, her posture rigid and her gaze unwavering. The spotlight illuminated her perfectly coiffed silver hair and designer gown, a stark contrast to the shadows that seemed to cling to her children seated in the front row. As Erin began her acceptance speech for Businesswoman of the Year, her voice rang out with practiced authority. Success, she declared, is not inherited. It is built, brick by brick, sacrifice by sacrifice. The words echoed through the room, met with enthusiastic applause from the business elite in attendance, yet, in the front row, her children shifted uncomfortably, their smiles strained and eyes distant. The speech continued, a testament to Erin's ruthless climb to the top of the hospitality industry. As she spoke of her achievements, quick flashes of memory intruded upon her consciousness. She saw herself, younger and hungry for success, missing her daughter Julia's dance recital to close a deal. She remembered harsh words exchanged with her son over dinner, insisting that sentiment had no place in business decisions. These glimpses of the past were fleeting, yet they left an almost imperceptible tremor in Erin's voice. She pushed through, her words becoming a litany of triumphs and acquisitions, with each accomplishment listed. The tension in her children's faces grew more pronounced. Julia, conspicuously absent from the family group, haunted the edges of Erin's vision like a persistent ghost. As Erin concluded her speech to thunderous applause, a subtle wave of dizziness washed over her. She gripped the podium tightly, maintaining her smile as camera flashes erupted around her. The moment passed, and she descended from the stage with practiced grace, accepting congratulations with regal nods. Later, in the quiet of her dressing room, Erin sat before the vanity mirror. The sounds of the gala filtered through the closed door, a muffled reminder of her public triumph. She studied her reflection, noting the lines that even the most expensive creams could not erase. Suddenly, another wave of dizziness struck, more intense than before. Erin's hand shot out to steady herself, knocking over a crystal perfume bottle. It shattered against the mirror, creating a web of cracks across the glass. As she looked up, Erin found herself staring at a fractured reflection, her face split into a dozen disjointed pieces. The metaphor was not lost on her, and for a brief moment, a flicker of uncertainty crossed her features. In that fragmented reflection, Erin saw not just herself, but the splintered remains of relationships sacrificed on the altar of ambition. The cracks in the mirror seemed to reach out, threatening to shatter the carefully constructed image she had maintained for decades. As she sat there, surrounded by the trappings of her success, Erin felt the first tremors of a foundation that was not as solid as she had believed. The morning light filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Erin's luxurious penthouse, casting long shadows across the imported marble floors. Erin stirred in her king-sized bed, silk sheets rustling as she awakened. Something felt off. The familiar crispness that usually accompanied her mornings had been replaced by a strange heaviness that seemed to permeate her entire being. As Erin attempted to rise, her body betrayed her. Her limbs felt leaden, unresponsive to her mental commands. A flicker of panic ignited in her chest as she struggled to sit up, her movements uncharacteristically clumsy and uncoordinated. The woman who had built an empire through sheer force of will now found herself unable to perform the simplest of tasks. Frustration mounting, Erin tried to call out for help. Her voice, usually sharp and commanding, emerged as little more than a weak rasp. The sound died in her throat, barely audible even in the quiet of her bedroom. Her heart raced as the reality of her situation began to set in. In a desperate attempt to reach her phone on the nightstand, Erin shifted her weight. The motion, unbalanced and awkward, sent her tumbling to the floor. As she fell, her arm caught the edge of a side table, sending a silver-framed photograph crashing down beside her. Lying on the cold marble, Erin's gaze fell upon the scattered remnants of the broken frame. The photograph within had come to rest face up, a cruel reminder of happier times. It showed the entire Scott family at a long-ago Christmas gathering. Erin stood at the center, imperious and proud, flanked by her children. On the far edge of the group stood Julia, her smile strained, her body language speaking volumes about her discomfort. The sight of the photograph triggered a vivid flashback. Erin saw herself seated at the head of a long dining table, crystal glasses glinting in the chandelier light. Julia sat across from her, eyes downcast as Erin's voice rose in anger. The words echoed in Erin's mind, sharp and cutting, as she berated her daughter for her foolish career choices and embarrassing lifestyle. The memory of Julia's face, crumpling under the weight of her mother's disapproval, sent a jolt of something unfamiliar through Erin's chest. Time seemed to stretch as Erin lay there, unable to move, trapped with her thoughts and regrets. The penthouse, once a symbol of her success, now felt like a gilded cage. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the faint ticking of an antique clock, a reminder of precious minutes slipping away. It was not until much later that Erin's housekeeper arrived, gasping in shock at the sight of her employer sprawled on the floor. The world erupted into a flurry of activity: calls made, paramedics summoned, the quiet sanctuary of the penthouse invaded by urgency and fear. The scene shifted abruptly. Harsh fluorescent lights replaced the warm glow of Erin's bedroom. The soft whir of medical equipment and the antiseptic smell of a hospital room assaulted her senses. Erin found herself surrounded by a team of doctors, their faces grave as they conferred over charts and scans. One doctor stepped forward, his expression a practiced mix of compassion and professional detachment. "Mrs. Scott," he began, his tone measured and serious, "you have suffered a stroke. You will need constant care moving forward." The words hung in the air, heavy with implications. Erin, the woman who had always prided herself on her strength and independence, now faced a future where she would be reliant on others. As the reality of her situation sank in, Erin closed her eyes, shutting out the concerned faces around her. In the darkness behind her eyelids, she saw the fractured family photograph, a stark reminder of the true cost of her lifelong pursuit of success. Erin Scott sat in her opulent living room, a stark contrast to her diminished physical state. The woman who once commanded boardrooms with an iron will now struggled to grasp the sleek smartphone in her partially paralyzed hand. Her fingers, once adorned with perfectly manicured nails, now trembled as she attempted to dial a number she had rarely used in the past. The phone slipped from her grasp, clattering onto the marble floor. Erin's jaw clenched in frustration, a glimpse of her former self shining through the veil of vulnerability that had descended upon her. She had faced countless challenges in building her empire, but none quite like this, the challenge of asking for help. As the days passed, Erin's living room became a stage for a series of painful rejections. Her children, each contacted in turn, found reasons to avoid the responsibility of caring for their ailing mother. The scenes played out like a montage of excuses and thinly veiled resentment. Her eldest son, Steve, had appeared on the video call from his corner office, Manhattan's skyline visible behind him. His words were polite but firm, citing critical business deals that required his constant attention. The irony of his excuse, so similar to those Erin had used throughout their childhood, was not lost on her. Erin's daughter, Sarah, had called from her yoga retreat in Bali. Her voice dripped with false sympathy as she explained how her spiritual journey could not be interrupted. The lush, tropical background of her call seemed to mock the sterile, oppressive atmosphere of Erin's apartment. The youngest son, James, had not even bothered with a video call. His text message, brief and to the point, claimed that his new family in Australia needed him more. The distance he had put between himself and his mother was now more than just geographical. With each rejection, Erin's frustration grew. The phone, once a tool of her power and connection, became a symbol of her isolation. In a rare display of unbridled emotion, she hurled the device across the room, watching with grim satisfaction as it shattered against the wall. The sound of breaking glass brought Erin's housekeeper rushing into the room. The older woman, Maria, had been a constant presence in the Scott household for decades, silently witnessing the family's slow disintegration. She knelt to clean up the broken pieces, her movements careful and practiced. As Maria worked, she spoke softly, almost to herself, "It is a shame about the children. But perhaps there is another way. Erin's eyes snapped to her housekeeper, a mix of curiosity and desperation in her gaze. Maria continued, her voice gaining confidence. I heard about Miss Julia. They say she has a posada now. A beautiful place, from what I understand. The mention of Julia's name hung in the air like a tangible thing. Erin's expression shifted, a complex interplay of emotions crossing her face. There was a flicker of reluctant pride at her daughter's apparent success, quickly overshadowed by the weight of their shared history and the desperation of her current situation. Erin stared out the window, the sprawling cityscape before her suddenly feeling claustrophobic, Parody, a small coastal town, worlds away from the life she had built. And Julia, the daughter she had driven away with her unyielding expectations and harsh words. The irony of potentially needing her most estranged child was not lost on Erin. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the room, Erin remained motionless in her chair. The broken phone lay forgotten on the floor, a fitting metaphor for the shattered relationships that now haunted her. The possibility of reaching out to Julia loomed before her, both a lifeline and a reckoning. Erin closed her eyes, the weight of her past decisions pressing down upon her with an almost physical force. The empire she had built now felt like a prison, and the key to her freedom lay in the hands of the very person she had pushed away the hardest. The adapted van wound its way through the cobblestone streets of Parody, a stark contrast to the sleek limousines Erin Scott had grown accustomed to. As the vehicle approached a modest yet charming posada, Erin's grip on her armrest tightened, her knuckles white with tension. The quaint inn, with its weathered wooden facade and lush garden, seemed to mock everything she had spent her life pursuing. As the van came to a stop, Erin's eyes darted nervously, taking in the rustic surroundings. The sound of waves crashing nearby and the scent of tropical flowers filled the air, a sensory experience worlds away from the sterile luxury of her penthouse. The driver, sensing her hesitation, patiently waited for her to gather her courage. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the posada's entrance. Julia stood frozen, her eyes wide with surprise and unmistakable apprehension. The years had changed her, gone was the timid girl Erin remembered. In her place stood a woman with sun-kissed skin and an air of quiet confidence. Though tension radiated from her rigid posture, the moment stretched, heavy with unspoken words and years of pent-up emotions. Erin, still seated in the van, found herself unable to make the first move. It was Julia who finally broke the stalemate, approaching the vehicle with measured steps. As Julia drew closer, the stark differences between mother and daughter became even more apparent. Erin's designer clothes and perfectly coiffed hair seemed out of place in the laid-back coastal town. Julia, dressed in simple linen clothes with her hair pulled back in a casual braid, embodied the very lifestyle Erin had once derided. The conversation that followed was a minefield of old hurts and new revelations. Erin, her voice uncharacteristically subdued, explained her situation: the stroke, the rejection from her other children, her desperate need for care. Each word seemed to cost her. Pride warring with necessity, Julia listened, her expression a complex mix of emotions: anger, pity, and a reluctant sense of duty. She spoke of the years of emotional distance, the cutting words that had driven her away, the life she had built for herself far from her mother's influence. The pain in her voice was palpable, a testament to wounds that had never truly healed. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the posada's garden, a heavy silence fell between them. Erin, exhausted both physically and emotionally, waited for her daughter's verdict. The possibility of rejection loomed large, threatening to leave her truly alone for the first time in her life. Julia's decision, when it came, was delivered with a mix of resignation and resolve. Her words were carefully chosen, laden with unspoken conditions and boundaries. "You can stay, Mother," she said, her tone guarded. "But do not expect things to be as they were before." The statement hung in the air, both an olive branch and a warning. Erin nodded, unable to muster a response. As Julia turned to make arrangements for her mother's stay, Erin remained in the van, overwhelmed by the magnitude of the change before her. The Posada, with its simple charm and natural beauty, represented everything Erin had spent a lifetime dismissing. Now, it would become her sanctuary and perhaps her purgatory. As the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Erin steeled herself for what lay ahead. The journey that had brought her to this moment had been one of desperation, but the path forward was shrouded in uncertainty. The sound of Julia's retreating footsteps mingled with the distant crash of waves, a rhythmic reminder of the ebb and flow of life's fortunes. For Erin Scott, accustomed to controlling every aspect of her existence, this new chapter promised to be the most challenging yet. The empire of glass she had built now lay shattered. And in its place stood the daunting prospect of rebuilding not a business, but the very foundations of a long-neglected relationship. The morning sun streamed through the open windows of the Posada's dining area, casting a warm glow on the rustic wooden tables. Erin Scott, accustomed to fine china and silver cutlery, found herself staring perplexedly at the set of bamboo utensils before her. If you're enjoying the story, don't forget to subscribe and share your thoughts in the comments below. Her fingers, still clumsy from the stroke, fumbled with the unfamiliar implements as she attempted to spear a piece of fresh tropical fruit. The fork slipped from her grasp, clattering loudly against the ceramic plate. Erin's face flushed with a mixture of embarrassment and frustration, her eyes darting around to see if anyone had noticed her struggle. The other guests, a mix of laid-back tourists and locals, seemed oblivious to her plight, engrossed in their own conversations and the simple yet delicious breakfast spread. As the day progressed, Erin found herself reluctantly drawn into observing the daily rhythms of the Posada. From her vantage point on the shaded veranda, she watched as Julia moved through the property with an easy grace that Erin had never seen in her before. Julia's interactions with the guests were warm and genuine, a far cry from the rigid professionalism Erin had always insisted upon in her own hotels. In the lush garden that surrounded the Posada, Erin caught glimpses of a man she assumed to be Julia's husband. He sat beneath a gnarled old tree, strumming a guitar and singing softly. The melodies drifted on the breeze, mingling with the sound of nearby waves and the chatter of colorful birds. Guests gathered around him, swaying to the music, their faces relaxed and content. Perhaps most surprising to Erin was the sight of a young girl, no more than 7 years old, diligently working in a small vegetable garden. With a start, Erin realized this must be her granddaughter, a child she had never met, whose existence she had barely acknowledged. The girl's hands were dirty, her hair wild and sun-bleached, but her face shone with a joy that seemed almost foreign to Erin. As the day wore on, Erin felt increasingly out of place. The casual atmosphere of the Posada grated against everything she had built her life around. The lack of formal schedules, the absence of uniformed staff, the way guests and hosts mingled freely, it all seemed to Erin like a recipe for disaster. Unable to contain herself any longer, Erin cornered Julia near the reception area. Her words were sharp, critical, as she pointed out what she perceived as glaring flaws in the Posada's operation. "This lack of professionalism will not do," Erin had said, her tone reverting to that of the stern businesswoman she had always been. "You are running a business, not a commune." Julia's response had been equally sharp, years of pent-up frustration evident in her voice. She defended her choices, her lifestyle, and the success of her Posada with a fierce pride that momentarily stunned Erin into silence. As the two women faced off, tension crackling between them, neither noticed the approach of the young girl from the garden. Her small voice cut through their argument like a knife through butter. "Grandma, why are you always angry?" The innocence of the question hung in the air, bringing the confrontation to an abrupt halt. Erin stared at her granddaughter, seeing in her eyes a mixture of curiosity and concern that was entirely devoid of the fear or resentment she was accustomed to seeing in her own children's eyes. In that moment, as the sounds of the Posada continued around them, the distant strum of a guitar, the laughter of guests, the rustle of leaves in the sea breeze, Erin felt the first cracks forming in the armor she had worn for so long. The question, simple yet profound, forced her to confront not just her current behavior, but a lifetime of choices that had led her to this point. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in brilliant hues of orange and pink, Erin retreated to her room. The day's events played over in her mind, a stark contrast between the world she had built and the one Julia had chosen. The question remained, could Erin adapt to this new reality, or would the collision of these two worlds prove too much for either to survive intact? The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the Posada's garden, where Erin Scott sat in her wheelchair, a silent observer to a world she had long dismissed. Her granddaughter, Sophia, darted between the trees with a group of local children, their laughter echoing through the air like wind chimes. Erin's eyes, once sharp with judgment, now held a mixture of wonder and regret as she watched the carefree play unfold before her. As the days passed, Erin found herself slowly, almost imperceptibly, being drawn into the rhythm of the Posada. Her businessman's mind, honed by decades of cutthroat corporate battles, couldn't help but analyze the operations around her. At first, she had bitten her tongue, remembering the tension her previous criticisms had caused, but as she observed more closely, she began to see the method in what she had initially perceived as madness. One morning, as Julia struggled with a particularly difficult guest booking, Erin hesitantly offered a suggestion. Her voice, once commanding, now held a note of uncertainty. Julia had tensed, prepared for another critique, but as she listened, her expression shifted from wariness to grudging consideration. The solution Erin proposed was efficient, drawing on years of hospitality experience. Yet adapted to the Posada's more personal approach, this moment marked a turning point. Erin began to offer more advice, always cautiously, always framed as a suggestion rather than a command. Julia, initially resistant, found herself increasingly receptive to her mother's input. The tension between them remained, a taut wire of unresolved history, but it began to vibrate with a new frequency, one of potential collaboration rather than conflict. Erin's involvement extended beyond management advice. She found herself drawn to the small details of Posada life that she had initially scorned. The herb garden, once dismissed as frivolous, became a source of fascination. Erin spent hours with Sophia, learning the names and uses of each plant, her manicured hands gradually becoming stained with rich earth. The guests, too, became more than faceless customers to Erin. She learned their names, their stories, understanding for the first time the value of the personal touch Julia had always emphasized. The businessman in her recognized the loyalty this approach fostered, while a long-dormant part of her soul responded to the genuine human connections being formed, as weeks turned to months. The Posada worked its subtle magic on Erin. The rigid schedule she had lived by for decades gave way to a more fluid rhythm dictated by tides and sunsets. Her designer suits hung unworn in the closet, replaced by comfortable linens that moved with the sea breeze. The constant ping of emails and calls faded, replaced by the sound of waves and distant laughter. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in vibrant hues, the Posada's guests and staff gathered around a bonfire on the beach. Erin, wrapped in a soft shawl against the evening chill, found herself wheeled to the edge of the gathering by Sophia. The flames cast flickering shadows on the faces around her. Faces that had become familiar and, surprisingly, dear. As the night deepened, Julia and her husband began to sing. Their voices, intertwining in harmony, rose above the crackle of the fire. The song was one Erin didn't recognize, a local ballad of love and loss, of time's passage and the enduring power of family. As she listened, Erin felt something shift within her, like a long frozen river beginning to thaw. Unbidden, tears began to slide down Erin's cheeks. She made no move to wipe them away, allowing herself, perhaps for the first time in decades, to simply feel. The tears were for the years lost, for the hardness she had cultivated like a shield, for the simple joys she had denied herself in pursuit of an empire that now seemed hollow. As the song ended, Erin caught Julia's eye across the fire. In that moment, no words were needed. The flames reflected in their shared gaze, illuminating a path forward uncertain and fraught with challenges, but filled with a potential for healing that neither had dared to hope for. The night wore on, stories and songs blending with the rhythm of the waves. Erin remained silent, absorbing the warmth of the gathering. The sincerity of the connections around her. As the embers of the fire began to fade, she realized that something had taken root within her, small and fragile, but undeniably alive. It was a seed of change, watered by tears and warmed by the unexpected joy of simple human connection. What it would grow into remained to be seen, but for the first time in longer than she could remember, Erin Scott looked to the future with something approaching hope. The tranquil morning at the Posada was shattered by the sound of tires crunching on gravel. A sleek, black luxury car, its polished surface reflecting the surrounding greenery like an alien object, pulled up to the modest entrance. The contrast was jarring, a piece of Erin's old world suddenly intruding upon the peaceful haven she had grudgingly come to appreciate. 3 men emerged from the vehicle, their crisp suits and polished shoes a stark contrast to the casual attire of the Posada's guests. They moved with the confident air of those accustomed to bending the world to their will. Erin, watching from her usual spot on the veranda, felt a familiar stirring in her chest, the thrill of high-stakes business that she had thought long buried. Julia greeted the men with polite wariness, her posture tense as she led them to a private corner of the garden. Erin, curiosity piqued, wheeled herself closer, ostensibly tending to nearby plants. As the conversation unfolded, fragments drifted to her ears, words like development, opportunity, and substantial offer. The businessmen's proposal soon became clear. They represented a large international hotel chain, one Erin knew well from her days at the top. Their plan was ambitious: to buy out the Posada and surrounding land, transforming the quiet coastal nook into a sprawling luxury resort. The figure they quoted made even Erin's eyes widen. It was a life-changing sum. The kind of money that could set Julia and her family up for generations. As Julia listened, her expression a mixture of shock and growing anger, Erin found herself unexpectedly torn. Part of her, the ruthless businesswoman she had been for so long, saw the undeniable logic of the offer. It was a golden opportunity, the kind that comes once in a lifetime. Yet another part, one that had been slowly awakening during her time at the Posada, recoiled at the thought of this peaceful place being transformed into another soulless luxury destination. Before she could fully process her own conflicting emotions, Erin found herself speaking up, her voice, carrying the authority of years of business acumen, began to outline the potential benefits of the deal. She spoke of financial security, of opportunities for growth, of a legacy that could extend far beyond the modest Posada. As Erin spoke, she watched Julia's face transform. The initial shock gave way to disbelief, then to a fury that seemed to radiate from her very being. The businessmen, sensing the shift in atmosphere, tactfully excused themselves, leaving behind their cards and the promise of time to consider the offer. The moment they were out of earshot, Julia rounded on Erin. Chapter 8. The True Legacy. The first light of dawn crept through the curtains of Erin's room at the Posada, casting a soft glow on the weathered wooden floor. Erin sat on the edge of her bed, a small box open beside her. With trembling hands, she sifted through old photographs, each image a snapshot of a life she had lived but never truly experienced. Her fingers lingered on a picture of a much younger Julia, her smile bright and unguarded. Erin's throat tightened as she remembered the countless moments she had missed, sacrificed on the altar of her ambition. The weight of her choices, the true cost of her empire, settled on her shoulders like a physical burden. As the morning progressed, Erin made a decision, with a determination reminiscent of her boardroom days, but tempered with a newfound humility. She arranged a meeting. The Posada's small conference room, usually reserved for local community gatherings, now held an unlikely assembly. Julia and her husband, little Sophia, and the suited businessmen who had arrived with their tempting offer. Erin wheeled herself to the head of the table, her posture straight despite the emotional weight she carried. She began to speak, her voice low but clear, carrying the authority of hard-won wisdom. She spoke of her life, of the empire she had built and the family she had lost in the process. She acknowledged the allure of the offer on the table, the promise of wealth and expansion that once would have been irresistible to her. But then her tone shifted. Erin spoke of the lessons she had learned in her time at the Posada. She described the value she had discovered in simple moments, the laughter of children playing in the garden, the warmth of a community gathered around a bonfire, the peace found in watching a sunset with loved ones. Her voice cracked as she admitted her mistakes, the years of prioritizing profit over people, of measuring success in dollars rather than in moments of joy. The room fell silent as Erin turned to the businessman. With a firmness that brooked no argument, she rejected their offer. She spoke of legacy, not of money and property, but of values, of community, of the importance of preserving places that nurtured the soul. Finally, Erin turned to Julia. The apology that followed was raw and unvarnished. Erin acknowledged the hurt she had caused, the years of criticism and absence. She asked for forgiveness, not with the expectation of receiving it, but with the understanding that the asking itself was a necessary step in her own journey of change. The days that followed saw a subtle but profound shift in the Posada's atmosphere. Erin, no longer an outsider, began to integrate herself into the daily rhythms of the place. She could be seen in the early mornings, offering gentle suggestions to the staff, her years of experience now used to support rather than to dominate. In the afternoons, Erin often sat in the garden with Sophia, listening with genuine interest as her granddaughter explained the intricacies of her latest art project or the plot of a beloved book. The sound of their shared laughter became a familiar and welcome addition to the Posada's ambience. Julia, initially wary, found herself gradually warming to this new version of her mother. Their conversations, once fraught with tension, began to take on a tone of cautious openness. They spoke of the past, of old wounds and misunderstandings, but also of the future, of hopes and possibilities neither had dared to consider before. As weeks turned to months, the Posada flourished. Erin's business acumen, softened by her newfound appreciation for the human element, helped streamline operations without sacrificing the warmth and personality that made the place special. Guests often commented on the unique atmosphere, the sense of family that seemed to permeate every interaction. On a particularly beautiful evening, as the sun began its descent into the sea, painting the sky in brilliant hues of orange and pink, Erin and Julia found themselves walking along the beach. They moved slowly, Erin's wheelchair leaving tracks in the sand alongside Julia's footprints. The silence between them was comfortable, filled with the sound of waves and distant laughter from the Posada. As they paused to watch the final moments of the sunset, Julia reached out and took her mother's hand. No words were needed in that moment. The simple gesture spoke volumes of forgiveness offered and accepted, of a relationship healing, of a future neither had imagined possible. The last rays of sunlight glinted off the waves, a fitting metaphor for the journey Erin had undergone. Like the ocean before them, she had experienced turbulent times, moments of darkness, but had ultimately found her way to calmer waters. As darkness fell and the first stars appeared in the sky, Erin Scott realized that she had finally discovered her true legacy, not in the buildings she had erected or the fortunes she had amassed, but in the bonds she had rebuilt and the love she had rediscovered. The Posada lights twinkled in the distance, beckoning them home. Mother and daughter turned back, their silhouettes merging in the twilight, two generations united in a way that once seemed impossible. The true measure of Erin's transformation was not in grand gestures or dramatic declarations, but in this quiet moment of connection, in the peace that had finally found its way into her heart. If you enjoyed this story, subscribe now so you don't miss the next one from Lily's Stories. Thank you for listening. Hope to see you in the next one.